Well, good morning and welcome to you who are here in the room and to the people who are following via the live stream. Congratulations for being this brave core that really, despite the weather and Christmas and everything, sticks to this 10 o'clock class. And today, so we have the fourth and last of our series of lectures on Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. I mean, 4 lectures about just one novel seems a lot, and yet I have the distinct feeling that we could, or at least I could go on forever, because the more I explore this book and this series of books, the Gilead series, good morning, the more I discover new levels and new layers. And it's quite impressive the amount of commentators and secondary literature and criticism that has been published over the years about this book. I've been reading a lot of this recently, and it is clear, I mean, it's not an overstatement to say that Marilynne Robinson has become or is seen increasingly as one of the most important novelists alive. I remember she came to Cambridge when I was in Cambridge in 2000, probably I must have been 17 or 18 to give a series of lectures. So I went to see lectures on the book of Genesis, and then she published a book on it. And she's also a wonderful lecturer. So today we are going to touch one of the aspects of the novel that I think strikes. I mean, it's almost the atmosphere in which the novel bathes, and probably for that reason is slightly more difficult to capture. But I think it's absolutely essential to point out too, and it is something that concerns the place, the role of memory, the relation between memory and identity, who we are, and also the way in which through memory we construct places. So this might seem very abstract, but I hope that you will find in this something you can relate to. At least I did. So whenever we are asked, who are you? Or you ask someone else, you meet for the first time, who are you? The first thing, obviously, that we share with each other is data. Okay? Your name, your family name, your nationality, where you are from, what is your job, what has been your education, etc. And this allows us most of the time just to place people in a box. We immediately determined what is the social standing of this person, how, in a lot of cases, how other people, when they ask you, especially, that's a very American thing, to ask very directly, what do you do? What's your job? So that, I immediately see what I can get out of you. But this is the first amount of information we exchange, but we also have to acknowledge that this says to us very little about who someone really is. Knowledge of people only comes through acquaintance, familiarity, rubbing shoulders with people, being with them a lot. Because who someone really is cannot be easily communicated through information. Obviously, you can say a lot about people. When you try to describe to someone else who a person is, you can say a lot. But the thing is that there is this famous Moravian, don't know if you ever heard of this, Moravian model, which is based on kind of scientific or pseudoscientific studies about how we communicate. And apparently there is this number 7, 38, 55. 7, 38, 55 is not on the handouts. So when we engage with other people, only 7% of the communication, in this moment, only 7% of the communication is coming from me to you. by what I'm saying, by the information I'm giving to you. 38% comes from the tone of the voice of the information you receive, and 55% from facial expression. Okay, so look at my face very well, because a lot of the information is going to come through this. And obviously with Italians, probably 200% with the hands. When I look at the recordings of myself, I mean, I can't believe how much I use my hands. I mean, it's just constant. When I first moved to France, people used to mock me a lot about this, so I used to speak with my hands in my pocket. It was the only, but I still was agitating my pockets in this way. So 7, 38, 55, which means that the only way of really knowing someone, communicating with someone, necessitates like physical presence, necessitates interaction, because a lot of the communication is non-verbal, is part of the tone of the voice and facial expression. Even what is experience of another person, though, so even what we communicate, whether verbally, whether with the tone of the voice, whether with the facial expression, has to go through a process of evaluation, of interpretation, and of selection. So whether we are aware of this or not, whatever we hear, whatever we experience of another person is something we constantly interpret, constantly think about. Whenever we remember what has happened in our interaction with a person, we always see things from a different aspect, and often, we realize the real meaning of a gesture, the real meaning of a word, only after a long time, only after having thought about something a lot. Behaviors that seem to mean one thing turn out to mean another. I remember famously there was a case in which it happened to me several years ago in an important meeting, when I was about to be elected, a very important place, a very important role in my order, Benedictine order, when I was. And there was this guy who I thought, was actively campaigning for me and lobbying for me. And I remember even thanking him, how being grateful to him about how his support. And then I discovered that he'd been undermining me the whole time and campaigning against me. So and my husband constantly tells me I'm not good at reading people. I really am not. It is true. I never see, especially if someone wants to do something bad to me, I never see it. And whereas he's very good at reading people, very good at reading people. So this expression of reading people, I find very interesting. We talk about reading people in the same way we read a book. Have you ever thought about this? This is really, really, really very interesting. Whenever we read a book, what we do is that we put into this book everything the whole of our life. This is why a book read when we are a young age has an impact on us, which is very different from the impact a book has on us, the same book, when we read it 20 or 30 years later. Because reading grows with the reader. That's something which has been said about Scripture. It's said that the Scripture, the Bible, grows with the reader. Scriptura cum legenti crescit, in Latin. But it is true of every book. Every book grows with the reader. Okay, and this I think is something that becomes very interesting when we move from the knowledge of other people to the knowledge of ourselves. So, number 4, how good are at reading ourselves? At reading ourselves. If we think that it is difficult to read other people, we have to acknowledge that it is even more difficult to read ourselves, what is called self-knowledge. And this is famously acknowledged by St. Augustine in his Confessions, when he says that I had become to myself a vast question. I had become to myself a vast question. And the whole of the Confessions really, Augustine's Confessions, this is why they are so such a powerful and immortal work, is because he has really taken very, very seriously the difficulty we have in knowing ourselves. We think we know ourselves, but the reality is that the more we engage in the exercise of self-knowledge, the more we realize how undecipherable we are, how difficult it is to really know ourselves. Why? Because we are constantly probably, I wouldn't say lying to ourselves, but giving a better version or a worse version of ourselves, depending on whether we have a tendency to self-complacency or flattery or to self-deprecation. It is incredibly difficult to read ourselves, to be objective about ourselves. When Augustine says that we are a vast question to ourselves, we are a mystery to ourselves, he has in mind three things. He has in mind the experience of grief, he has in mind the experience of our will, and he has in mind the experience of memory. So, grief because and he talks about this. He talks about the death of his friend, his closest friend when he was an adolescent. And he does say that the death of this person threw into question everything he thought he knew about himself. All his desires, all his expectations, all his projects, all his view on life. And there is a mark, a kind of a very important change in his life the moment he experiences grief. This is why grief is always something that throws us into deep question. We become a question to ourselves when we experience grief. The second experience that leads Augustine to realize the extent which is a mystery to himself is something that Paul says: how is it that I want to do something and I do another? How it is that I want to be good and I know and I keep like doing things I'm not proud about, etc., etc. So the experience of the will. And then the third thing on which I want to focus today is the issue of memory. Memory constantly baffles us, plays up with us. We talked, if you remember, when we looked at the little life of Yanagihara, about the trauma, the experience of trauma. When we experience trauma, we suppress memories. So there are events in our lives that have shaped our lives and conditioned our lives in ways that are sometimes devastating, and we can't remember. They are completely erased. Or there are memories which also are not even not traumatic, but that come back to us at some point, and we don't know why. We don't know why at some point there is something that triggers a memory, and this famously has been explored by Proust. The Marylinne of Proust. He eats this Marylinne, and this opens him, a vast kind of aspect of his memory, which goes on for 4 volumes, 5 volumes, 6 volumes. La recherche du temps perdu, and that's a good example of how memory for Augustine is this immense repository. It's like the I don't know how you call this in English. This place where we stock all our things for 50 years. We forget what we have there. One day we go there, and things come up that evoke a lot of memories. So our memory is exactly in the same way. Or positively, there is a memory we always had, but then at one point in our lives, that memory reveals to ourselves things that acquires a meaning that it didn't have before. Okay? So we might think, number 8, that this is not a big issue until we realize the deep connection that exists between memory and identity. Okay, why these memories? I mean, we can say they're only memories, but who are you? Who is every one of us? We are what we, not only what we remember of ourselves, but also what we make of our memories. You know, someone who loses his memory because of an accident or etc., does not know who he is anymore. We only know who we are because of what we remember about ourselves, but also thanks to what we do with the memory we have of ourselves. This is why our identity grows with the years, because with what we remember about ourselves, or rather the memories we have about our lives, about ourselves, about the people we have met, are constantly re-elaborated, constantly expanded, and constantly reinterpreted. So Rowan Williams, number 9, observes that there is no such thing as a timeless true self. We come to a perception of who we are by, and this is a very important sentence, this is a book on the edge of words, we come to a perception of who we are by sifting through remembered narratives. Sifting, selecting, re-elaborating remembered narratives. The self is the action that here and now gathers events narrated from the past and possible course of actions in the future into one story that is unceasingly being revised from one utterance to the next. What do we do when someone asks who we are? The first thing we do is we give data about ourselves, name, family name, job, etc. And the second thing, what do? We start telling stories. I was born there, my father did this with me, I had this experience. And the more we want to reveal about ourselves to other people, the more what we do, we talk about our life. But what we do is the same thing a novelist does. So we build a story. It might not be as elaborate as what we found in a novel, but what we do, we are all novelists in a sense. We are all constantly telling stories about ourselves. But this means that we are constantly constructing stories about ourselves, constructing narratives about ourselves. Narratives that we hope, number 9.3, may be worth of recognizing and answering. Okay? Why do we build a story? Because we hope that this story is going to be acknowledged by someone else, recognized. So when I tell a story about myself, I hope that other people will react to that, will see it as worth of their attention, of their consideration. Hence our fascination with narratives, so with stories, and with rituals. Now, rituals, I don't have the time to develop this, but it's something which I want to do at another time. Rituals like going to church and going to Mass. What do we do when we go to Mass? The first thing we do when we go to Mass is we have readings, okay? We are reading from the Old Testament, then we have a reading from the Gospels. We hear stories, and then with the homily, what we do, we are invited to identify with these stories, to see our place in these stories. So what we are doing is basically integrating constantly when we go Sunday after Sunday, Mass after Mass. This is one of the rituals. There are other rituals in our life. But with this one in particular, we are integrating our story into the broader narrative of the sacred history. So the history of the people of Israel becomes our history. The history of the church becomes our history. The history of Jesus becomes our history, etc., etc. So but the same thing we do when we celebrate, the 4th of July, the Feast of Independence. Why do we celebrate this? Because we consider that story, the story of this country, is our story. and we see ourselves and our place into this broader narrative. So it's, you see, we are constantly weaving a story, which is not just our story, but is the story of, the story of the world, the story of our, the sacred history, the history of our nation, and locating ourselves into this broader narrative. Now, all this is very important when it comes to appreciate what's happening in Gilead, because as you remember, in this novel, this elderly pastor is writing a letter to his son. Why? To tell him who he is. His son will be dead when his son will be old enough to be able to appreciate the importance of being the son of this man, and what and to receive the story in a way that becomes meaningful to him. So he wants to make sure that he gives to him as much as possible of who he is through this letter, and he does it by weaving into this, creating a narrative about who he is, and weaving into this narrative his own memories, the story of his family. So he talks about his father and his grandfather, the story of the town, Gilead, so the abolitionist history of the city, which we saw in our second meeting, the fight against slavery, and etc., etc., and also particularly the sacred history, because he's a Christian and talks all the time about God. So number 11:1, the way in which John Ames explains who he is to his son in his letter constantly recurs to memories of his life, his family, the impact that the history of the country and of his town had on him. He has a particular way to remember, which gives an altogether special meaning even to the apparently more prosaic events of his life. Now, that's the thing in which the novel is, Gilead is so striking, is the way in which the most simple elements of life can be, seeing people, young people kind of fooling around, can be the light strike, the light kind of the sun on trees. Or more importantly, celebration of a baptism, etc., etc. He apparently, simple memories become a way for him to say who he is. The way he relates these memories, the way he interprets these memories and relates them, communicate who he is to his son. 11:3, and the reader of the novel starts to understand who John Ames is, not only through what he says about himself, but especially through how he talks about himself. Which, what I told you about the Moravian model. Okay, 7% is the communication of words, but 38% is the tone of the voice, and 55% is the facial expression. So obviously, in a letter written to his son, there is no facial expression, but there is the tone of the voice. It's the way in which John Ames communicates, talks, that says a lot about who he is. So I collected a number of quotations from Gilead, in which I hope we can see a bit more the role of memory in the novel. So number 12, the first quotation, as I write, John Ames says, I am aware that my memory has made much of very little. Now this is an example of the irony. I don't know if I call it irony, but the bonhomie as well of John Ames. He's someone who is very understated, and he is, obviously he says he has made very much or very little, is a way of acknowledging, I know that a lot of the things I'm relating might seem as if I'm seeing too much into things. Like, you know, the example of these young people who are just playing with each other, and he sees in this something very beautiful, etc. But what he wants to say is that this is the real secret he wants to communicate to his son, how to see the beauty in absolutely everything in life. Passage number 13. I could have married again while I was still young. You remember that he was married very young to Louise, this woman, and had a child, but the child died immediately after he was born, and the mother died in childbirth, and remained a widow for the whole of his life, and basically someone who mulled his grief constantly until he met, when he was 67, the woman who became his wife, Lila. Okay? So he says, I could have married again while I was still young. A congregation likes to have a married minister, and I was introduced to every niece and sister-in-law in 100 miles. In retrospect, I'm grateful for whatever reluctance it was that kept me alone until your mother came. Now that I look back, you see the act of memory, the act of reinterpretation, act of revisiting memories. It seems to me that in all that deep darkness, a miracle was preparing. So I am right to remember it as a blessed time. So it was not a blessed time. It's a time that, you know, for a long time he saw as a negative time. But now he's reinterpreting this memory as a positive time, as a blessed time. And myself as waiting in confidence, even if I had no idea what I was waiting for. You see, that's exactly the exercise I'm describing to you. Then he talks about grief, the relation between grief and memory. So his child was born, the child with who died immediately after was born, and he had just the time to hold the child in his arms for a little bit before he died. And again, another memory here plays a role in the narrative he's building about himself. We had some very pleasant evenings here in my kitchen with his friend. You remember he was friend with Robert Bolton, the Presbyterian minister, who is the father of Jack, who is the nemesis of John Ames in this book. So Bolton is a staunch Presbyterian, as if there were another kind. So we have had our disagreements, though never grave enough to do any harm. I don't think it was resentment I felt then. It was more sort of loyalty to my own life, as if I wanted to say, I have a wife too, I have a child too. Obviously, Robert Bolton had 5 children, all very kind of, healthy and robust. And Robert Bolton, the Presbyterian minister, when Jack was born, asked John Ames to baptize him, and as he was baptizing him, decided to give him the name Jack John Ames. So it was a way of saying, I give my child to you. And John Ames, you know, the Congregationalist pastor, instead of feeling grateful, feels resentful, because it's a way of saying, oh, you think that I'm so pathetic, I've lost my wife, I lost my child, so I need your child, and you are rubbing it in my nose somehow that, you know, I couldn't have a wife and a child and you have 5, etc., etc. So instead of feeling grateful, he feels resentful. And it is as he revisits his memories that he realizes the depth of his resentment, he had not been aware of. He realizes the extent to which that resentment has poisoned the life of the child and has made him responsible, in a sense, or at least partly, of the kind of the way the child had turned, which, you know, can be said was not a very good one, but also is a way of rewriting the history by through the elaboration of this memory, finding the strength to forgive, Jack, but also to change his attitude, his own attitude towards him. So he says, I don't think it was resentment I felt then. It was some sort of loyalty to my own wife, as I wanted to say, I have a wife too, and I have a child too. It was as if the price of having them, my wife and my child, was losing them, and I couldn't bear the implication that even that price could be too high. They say an infant can't see when it is as young as your sister was, but she opened her eyes and she looked at me, which obviously cannot have happened, and a newborn infant can't see. But this memory has grown in him, and it has become important for him to imagine, and he recognizes later that this is his imagination, that his child has looked at him before dying. She was such a little bit of a thing, but while I was holding her, she opened her eyes. I know she didn't really study my face. Memory, and here we have the key sentence, memory can make a thing seem to have been much more than it was. But I know she did look right into my eyes. That is something, and I'm glad I knew it at the time, because now, in my present situation, and now that I'm about to leave this world, I realize there is nothing more astonishing than a human face. So you see, this memory revisited and slightly amplified by his imagination is a stepping stone towards seeing life under a different light. Okay, and it is for him the occasion to for growth, for seeing the world in a different way, seeing other people in different ways. So he says, I realize there is nothing more astonishing than a human face. Borton and I have talked about that too. It has something to do with incarnation. You feel your obligation to a child when you have seen it and held it. Any human face is a claim on you, because you can't help but understand the singularity of it, the courage and loneliness of it. But this is truest of the face of an infant. I consider that to be one kind of vision as mystical as any. So the leitmotif, one of the leitmotifs of the novel is that, the real spiritual experiences are not extraordinary experiences, visions, and the visions, the mysticism of life is as to be found in ordinary aspects of our lives. Is the beauty we discover in things where we don't think we can find it. And this is exactly, the following passage is exactly the same idea, develops the same idea. I believe, now he's talking about his grandfather, who thought he had a vision that authorized him to use violence to fight against slavery, which was the occasion of a lot of conflicts in the family. So I believe that the old man did indeed have far too narrow an idea of what a vision might be. He may, so to speak, have been too dazzled by the great light of his experience to realize that an impressive sun shines on us all. So the real mystical experience is the sun. The real miracle we experience every day, the real vision, the real mysticism is in the fact that the sun shines every day. Perhaps that is the one thing I wish to tell you. Sometimes the visionary aspect of any particular day comes to you in the memory of it, or it opens to you over time. You see what he says about memory? So the visionary aspect, so you don't know you have had visions in your life. You don't know you have had mystical experiences until memory, at a certain stage in your life, opens up that experience you had and makes you realize, I had a vision there, in the sense that I had there something that really has unveiled a spiritual aspect of life, a spiritual aspect of existence that has made me a different, or can make me now a different person. For example, he says, whenever I take a child into my arms to be baptized, which a priest does 1,000,000 times, I am, so to speak, comprehended in the experience more fully, having seen more of life, knowing better what it means to affirm the sacredness of the human creature. I believe there are visions that come to us only in memory, in retrospect. That's the pulpit speaking, but it's telling the truth. And one of the key moments in which, something that happened to him, which was something incredibly simple. So there was this episode in which he was helping his father. I think a church had burned. They were clearing the rubbles. They were all covered in soot, etc., etc. And at one point, his father takes a biscuit covered in soot as well and gives it to his child. Okay. Who was very tired and was with him then, so to John Ames. So he remembers his father doing this, but this is a simple act of a father giving a biscuit to his child who is tired. But the context, the memory, the relation with the father, a lot of elements that he develops in the book make him remember this simple act as receiving communion. Okay, it was as if, he says, I'm not going to read the whole passage, number 16, just the hand. I remember it, my father giving me this biscuit, as communion, and I believe that's what it was. And I'm going to read the following passage. It is not surprising that I remember that day as if my father had given me communion, taking that bread from his side and breaking it for me with his ashy hands. But it is strange that I remember receiving it the way I do, since it was never been accustomed for the minister to place the bread of the communicants in the communicant's mouth. I mean, these are Congregationalists, Presbyterians, they don't do these things, as they do in some churches. I think of this because on the morning of communion, when your mother brought you forward and said, you ought to give him some of that. So Lila, at one point during a celebration, brought the child to his father and said to him, you have to give him communion, even if you don't give communion to a child who is too young usually. He said, I broke the bread and fed a bit of it to you from my hand, just the way my father would not have done except in my memory. And I know what I wanted in that moment was to give you some version of that same memory, which has been very dear to me, though only now do I realize how often it has been in my mind. So you see a simple memory that becomes like a sign of, the transmission of faith, the transmission of a bond, is something that he has kind of appropriated for himself and wants to communicate to his child as a way of saying to him who he is, as a way of establishing a bond with his child, the same bond he had with his father. So I'm going to skip on until 19. I'm going to read these commentators called Faith Danielson. So the passage which is just below the quotation number 19. So John Ames goes through a process of sober sacralization, she says. Through the writing of his letter to his son, in order to provide a context and means for conversation and instruction concerning the places that he has experienced as significant. By the term sacralization, I mean the designation of something as worthy of remembrance, reverence, and thoughtful analysis. So what he does is he sees the sacred in everything, and he wants to communicate this ability to see life as sacred, to see the most prosaic aspects of life as sacred. But it is a sober sacralization. By sober, I mean that the sacralization merits a solemnity and gravity, as well as a realistic understanding that things apart from God are fallible, but through understanding faults and failures comes greater wisdom and empathy. And that's the other thing. So it's not like a naive vision of life. It's not a exalted version of life. You know, sometimes people have this tendency to romanticize everything, to amplify everything. This is not a truthful way of remembering things. So one thing is really trying to revisit one's memory and trying to find the beauty in everything. Another thing is, you know, an exalted exercise of remembering that embellishes everything in a way that is not helpful. So this is why truthfulness is so important in this exercise of remembering. Truthfulness that leads him to acknowledge slowly flaws and sins he had made that he had not been aware of before. Namely, especially, the way in which his hidden resentment and refusal of Jack had poisoned or had contributed to poison Jack's life. And I'm going to read only, I'm going to read only the following passage as an example of this. I still remember, number 20, how those warm little brows felt under the palm of my hand when he baptized, I think here was baptized a child. Everyone expected a cat, but to touch one like that with the pure intention of blessing it, it is a very different thing. It stays in the mind. For years we would wonder what, from a cosmic viewpoint, we had done to them. It seems to me to be a real question. There is a reality in blessing, which I take baptism to be primarily. It doesn't enhance sacredness, but it acknowledges it. And there is a power in that. I felt it pass through me, so to speak. The sensation is of really knowing a creature. I mean, really feeling its mysterious life and your own mysterious life at the same time. I don't wish to be urging the ministry on you, he says to his son, but there are some advantages to it you might not know to take account of if I did not point them out. Not that you have to be a minister to confess blessing. You are simply much more likely to find yourself in that position. It's a thing people expect of you. I don't know why there is so little about this aspect of the calling in the literature. So you see, he, in the act of blessing or of baptizing, which obviously is sacred in itself, he sees, how this, what he calls this cosmic dimension, this acknowledging of the sacredness of life. You see this, and this is what he wants to communicate to his child. So I want to stop here just to leave some time for a little tiny time for question. The only thing I want to I hope that if you revisit this book with this viewpoint, realize that there is a huge lesson, and why this book resonates so powerfully is because it really teaches us a way of pursuing the exercise we all do, which is constantly building a story about ourselves, constantly revisiting our memories, but in a way that that is more truthful. And truthful does not mean that does not mean more literal. So memories are not facts. The act of remembering is not an act of writing a historical version of our life. History tries to, whether it is successful or not is another matter, but tries to establish facts and tell facts about the past. What we have to do, what we do anyway about our past life is never just establish facts, but is unearthing the hidden aspects of our memories, or the hidden significance of our memories. And this is what enables us to change our life, because we are all constantly conditioned by past events in our lives. And often negativity in our life is the result of a certain way in which we have interpreted past events. And the act of revisiting, which we constantly do, can help us to see to have another way of revisiting these memories, to see other aspects of these memories, the things that happen to us, the way we remember them, that might have a positive effect on us. So it is the way we look at them. This is why, just as a book grows with a reader, so our own stories, which is like a book, grows with us. And we are not, this helps us or allows us not to be fatalist about our life, because we are not determined or predetermined by the events of our life only in one direction. Even trauma can be revisited in such a way that from something destructive in our life becomes something constructive. So imagine all the other memories. So even not talking about the bad memories, but memories which might be or we might have thought are insignificant up to a certain moment. When we go back to them, we realize, oh, this had so much beauty in it. This had so much meaning in it. This had so much promise in it. And this allows this memory to shape ourselves in a different way, to tell a different story of our life to ourselves and to others, to write a different novel of our life, a different book on our life. And this is why, in the end, reading novels is so, great novels, is so life-enhancing, because it is a way of learning how to write a better novel about our life. We are constantly doing this. We are all novelists. We are constantly writing a story. We might not be as talented as Marilynne Robinson. We might never write it down. But certainly we had better write a first-class novel about our life with ourselves and with others, because the way we live our life depends on the story we tell ourselves about our lives. I'm afraid we'll have to end with a prayer on this. And since we are going to church now and we're going to Mass, and we are going to weave once again our story into the broader story of God's covenant with humanity, let us ask the Lord the gift, the grace of welcoming the blessing and the grace that is to have been wanted from God from all eternity, and to have an eternal destiny in God's plans. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.